Two of the most important Python concepts are how to use loops and how to use list comprehensions. In this video, let's understand both of them. Let's begin by understanding some of the key programming concepts. So I'm going to set up a whiteboard and let's cover the three main things that you need to know when you are learning any programming language. The first one is data types, and the second one is objects, and the third one is control flow. So let's go into each of these concepts first. When you are working with a programming language such as Python, you will need to store some data and perform operations on top of it. Going back to our student example, we had to store the information about their name, age, GPA, and the sports they are involved in. So all of these are contained in simple variables like name, age, etc. And internally, each of them will have a type of data associated with it. Programming languages like Python, VBA, etc. all want to have some sort of a control over these things. So they would like to know what is the data type in each of them. For example, name is a string data type. A string is basically where you can have some text values. Likewise, age would be an integer or a number, and then GPA is a floating point number. So computers use different kinds of mechanism to store this data. String would be stored in some ways, integer will be stored in a different way, floating point will be stored in a different way. Likewise, playing underscore volleyball, that is a Boolean value, so it will be just true or false, whereas sports, the list of items that we have maintained, is a list. As you have seen in the Visual Studio Code, when you are creating a notebook, and you can use the Jupyter tab to see all the data types that are available for your data and understand what is the size of things. Now the simple things like integer etc. are just maintained as is, but complicated stuff like list of sports are usually collected and maintained in special kinds of data types. And these are what we call as objects. We could consider everything to be an object, but essentially when we talk about an object, it is something where you are maintaining more complicated data. So for example, the list here that we used is an object of the list type. And when you have an object, the object will have some items in it. So for example, the list will have individual items of the list in it, as well as some methods or functions attached to it. So we use the sports.append method or append function to add another item to it. So essentially, one way of thinking about an object is collection of some data and some functions that do operations on top of that data. Going back to our example, the list is one kind of an object. Likewise, Python supports different types of objects, and we will use them as we start building more and more code. The third concept is control flow, and this is where the if condition that we used is a simple example. Control flow tells program how to branch out or do different things depending on what is going on. For example, to calculate the student's GPA, we are using if condition, and then we are saying if the value is less than or equal to 2, then the grade is D. Likewise, less than or equal to 3, then the grade is C, like that we are mentioning. Now, if you see in the program, we are writing all of it, but when you are running at that point in time, only one of these branches will run and produce the output. So that is one example of control flow. There is also another kind of a control flow where you may want to repeat a certain block of instructions X number of times or until some conditions are met. So these kind of control flows are called loops. A simple example is, let's say you're no longer dealing with Alice alone, you're dealing with a bunch of students, and you would like to calculate GPA, a letter point, letter grade for everybody of them. To do that, you can write a big program where for every student you repeat the instructions, or you can write a loop kind of a control flow where you're saying for every student in my data, do this and tell me what their letter grade is. These kind of things are achieved through loops in Python, and Python also supports different kinds of loops. We haven't seen any loop yet, but we will use that very soon. So this is kind of like a little bit background into how programming works. And again, Most of it is fairly obvious, but also if you have never done anything like this, some of it might seem a little bit scientific or complicated, especially while the technique or the underlying stuff is fairly straightforward. These names are what confuse people a lot. So that's why I thought, we'll just introduce this. Let's go back to our notebook here and continue our journey. Let's say we have done all of this and now we want to go back into our sports list and look at each sport and print that on the screen in a neat format. For example, if I just add a code block and here just write the letter sport, this word, and then run it, I'll get the list as this format. But I don't want to do this. Instead, what I want is I want a neat output where each sport is printed in one line. So this sort of a thing is where, because we want to print each one in a different line, we could use a loop. First up, I'll show you how to do this without a loop, and then we'll introduce the loop concept. So for example, we can use the print statement and say sports, open bracket 0, and print sports, open bracket 1. Now if I run this block alone, I'll get volleyball and netball. But as I have got 5 different sports, I'll need to repeat this for all the sports. And then change these numbers. And once I run it, I'll get all the 5. The problem with this kind of a code is it will need to repeat the instruction for any amount of values that we have. So here we have only 5 sports. But if we have got somebody that is super athletic, or if we have got a list of courses or subjects that person is doing, that list might be 15 items, 20 items, and our code starts to look a little bit ugly. So this is where loops come in handy. So this approach here uses individual items, whereas now we are going to write it through a loop. I'm going to actually change this to a markdown, and let's add the code. So here we're going to write the for loop like this: for sport in sports, print sport. So here what happens is the for loop here, we'll work out what that is in a minute. The for loop looks at the list of sports and then it picks each of those sports and then stores in this temporary variable called sport. Even though I'm using the word sport here, it doesn't really have to be sport. It can also be something like X. So think of X as a holding block that contains the first sport, and then this loops through until it finishes all of the items, and it will print all the 5 items nicely like this. This will work depending on how many items are there. Right now there are 5 items, so this for loop runs 5 times. But if you have got 50 items or 100 items, then this for loop keeps on repeating like that. Just as we have got for loop, there is also a while loop in Python, which can be used when you are iterating through not a collection, but you want to do it until some condition is met. Let's add one more line of code here. This time what I want to do is, for each of the sport, as I am printing, instead of simply saying volleyball, I want to also print a number there. I want to say 1 volleyball, 2 netball, 3 touch rugby, like that. So for this, what we will do is we will write a markdown block here. In this markdown, I'm going to set up our approach. So for this markdown, we are going to use H3. That's why 3 hashtags. And in this, here we will start by declaring a variable called I is equal to 0. And then we will say for X in sports, remember every time you write a control flow like if condition or for loop or while loop or anything, you must always have this extra colon at the end, and you need to indent your code. Visual Studio Code automatically indents your code for you, so you don't have to actually think about it. But if you don't do it, it will show these red squiggly lines underneath indicating that there is an error with your code. So here, what we will now want to do is, I want to say print. For some reason, my caps lock keeps getting turned on. But yeah, so print, and then we will use an F string here. And then in the F string, the first thing that we want to print is I dot, and then we want to print X. Now after this, if I just run it like this, you'll see that this will always say 0, 0, 0 like that, because our program begins with the assumption that I is 0. So it's started with 0. So initially when the loop ran the very first time, this value, it is looking at I is 0, and x would be whatever is the current value of the sport. So x is changing, but I is not changing. So we'll need to increase the I as well, and we will want to start I from 1. So I'm going to adjust my code here. I will begin from 1, and if I run this, now I'll get 1s, but I want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like that. So once this step is done, I want to increase the I value. So I'm going to say I is equal to I plus 1. What that does is, after this statement has done its job, I value will be incremented by 1. And now if I run this, you'll see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to get this. Now, as I'm seeing this, I'm noticing that the capitalization is inconsistent. For example, V is lower letter, N is lower letter, T is lower letter. This is also lower letter. Cricket is fine. So I would like to capitalize this into the very first letter as like the capital letter so that it looks good on the screen. So let's figure out how to take the value of X, and as we are looping and printing, convert that into an uppercase. Now this sort of a thing, you may want to solve this problem yourself, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Many of the common data problems like this, Python operates built-in solutions for that. So for example, there will be some sort of an uppercase, lowercase, proper case functioning available in Python library, but we don't know if that exists. So this is where we want to see what is available on X. If you go back to our theory earlier, we can think of X as a data type, but X is also a string, and it is an object of string, and it has the value of the X, which is, let's say, volleyball initially, but it will also have some methods or functions that are available on X that can be used to convert X value into something. So let's see what we can do there. I'm gonna press a dot next to it, and here you will see that X has all of these functions. This sort of a thing helps us quickly see what we want. So for example, I can capitalize X, I can lowercase the X value, I can split it, I can strip it, I can title case it. I think title is what we are looking for, but I'm going to start with capitalize and open bracket, close bracket like that, and run this again. So now you can see what capitalize is doing. It's basically capitalizing the very first letter. So touch is capitalized, but not the rugby. Likewise, C is capitalized here, but not this C. You may want to capitalize every word, and that sort of a thing would probably be title case, I think. And we will now get a much better representation of this data. So this is how you can add extra bits into the loop. Whatever you want to do inside the loop, they must all be indented like this. And anything else that you put, for example, if I want to say print we are done, notice that this is outside. So if I run this, after these 5 are printed, I'll get we are done here. But let's say I make a mistake and I kept this inside. Now what this will do is it will say volleyball, we are done, netball, we are done. So the statement, this extra print, is also being repeated for how many other sports we have there. So you will want to be careful with this sort of a thing. Whatever you are putting inside the loop, only those should be there, and anything else you want to just make sure that they are at the right indentation level. Before we talk about an alternative to the loops through list comprehension, let's go through another way to solve this problem by using the enumerate function of Python. This enumerate option offers us a more Pythonic way of writing this code. Let me explain this. So instead of writing the loop like this by declaring a variable I equal to 1 and then using the for loop for X in sports and iterating through the sports, we can use this enumerate function and we can say enumerate the sports. What this does is it basically does the loop for us. It generates each point of the sports, each of the sports, into a separate object, and that object will contain both index and X value. Index would be the location, and here I'm using start equal to 1 to indicate that I want the list to begin with 1. If I don't say that, then what happens is this will begin from 0. So if I run this, I'll get 0 volleyball, 1 netball, like that. So many times when we are looping through a collection like sports or anything else, we may want to not only access the item but also the position of the item. And in this case, instead of using this kind of a loop, which is more traditional, we can consider using this enumerate option. And here is another thing that is kind of unique within the world of Python. So normally when you are looping, you are expected to get just one value. But here in Python, this is something that is a very unique kind of a syntax where you are saying for idx comma x in enumerate. Because what enumerate is doing is internally it is returning a tuple. A tuple is basically two values. So it gives you the index value and then the value itself. And when the tuple is returned, we are asking Python to unpack the tuple. That means just split it and put it into these two holding blocks, index and x, and then we access them individually inside the loop. So we are saying print the index and print the title case of that x value as well. So that's what the enumerate does. It offers a optional parameter called start equal to 1 means I want my indexes to begin from 1 rather than the traditional 0 value of Python, and that way we will get this 1 2 3 4 5 notation. So this is in a way a little bit more efficient both in terms of writing but also internally through performance by execution time and memory management of Python, especially when you are going through very big lists or data frames or anything else in Python. Python also introduces a really powerful concept called comprehension, and we can use that as an alternative to looping through the data. For example, let's say I want to create a list of values that go from 1 to 100. One way of doing this is we can create a list like this. We can say number list is equal to an open bracket close bracket. This is how you create a blank list. And then we can say for I in range 100. Range is a function that is available in Python that generates a list of values. My number list dot append I. As this is going through the loop, at each point I value keeps changing. So it will initially be 0, then 1, then 2, like that. Now let's finish this loop and print the my number list. So when I run this, I'll finish that and I'll have a list that goes from 0 all the way up to 100. And as this is too many values, the output is usually truncated. But you can also see it in the Jupyter area here. If you look at the my number list, you'll see that item as 1100 size and all the items are listed here. I think you can also pop it out and it will ask you to enable a data viewer extension if you want to see that value. For now, I'm just not going to install that. So this is one way of creating such a list. But as you can see here, we are using a loop, and essentially what a loop is doing is it is running this particular line 100 times, each time changing the I value by 1. Another option is we can also use this concept called comprehension. It kind of looks a bit strange, but it is a really powerful thing. So let me first show you and then I'll explain how this is. We can say my number list 2, that's a different variable, and then open the brackets, and instead of creating a blank list and making a loop, we can straight away say this list should be with I for I in range 100. If you notice this bit is exactly same as our for loop here for I in range 100. But what list comprehension does is it will calculate the I value for this for loop, and as the loop is generating the values, it will keep putting that in the list and the final list will be created. So once this is created, let's return that into the screen, and when you run it, you will basically get the same list 0 through 99. So this is what a list comprehension is. It kind of, like I said, it avoids the loop altogether and produces much cleaner and simpler looking code. And it also allows you to come up with more complicated logic without having to write really long or elaborate loops. So let's take this one step further. Instead of just making the list of numbers like this, maybe what I want to do is I want to know what is the square of each number. Again, this is kind of getting into a little bit theoretical area. Normally, you don't need to do this kind of a thing in data analysis. But once you understand the concept, you can start telescoping it out and seeing how this applies in many real world scenarios. So let's make one more number list. This is squares of our numbers. And here I'm going to add a markdown. And let's add a code block. Create a variable called squares of first 100 nems, and open bracket I for I in range 100. And instead of just saying I, which will create just the list of 100 numbers, we want the I to be squared. So you can do this in two ways. You can say I star I, which is multiply I with itself, or you can also use 2 stars and then number 2, which indicates that you want to have I to the power of 2. So I square essentially. So either of these is fine. And when you do this, it will create that. And let's just print this as well. We are gonna write that, and when you do it, you'll have this nice list of all the squares of first 100 numbers. So you can see 0, 1, 4, 9, 16 like that, all the way up to 9801. Now here is a little bit twist. What if you want to have the squares of first 100 numbers, but the numbers should begin from 1, not 0? How would you modify this? Give it a try and let me know in the comments what your approach is. Later on, when we are doing some data analysis work, I'll explain how we can use list comprehensions or comprehensions in general to do some more complicated and interesting as well as realistic things. Obviously, from a learning perspective, learning how to make a list of 100 numbers or squares of them is good, but in real life, we don't ever have to do these kind of things. In our next Python video, we are going to discuss the NumPy package of Python as well as the matplotlib package of Python and understand how to use them to analyze the data and visualize the data. Stay tuned for that video and feel free to subscribe to my channel to get notified when that video goes live. If you enjoyed this video so far, give it a like and share it with some of your friends. I'll catch you again in another video. Until then, stay awesome. Bye.